This is an Irreverent podcast. Check out irreverent.fm for shows from all our friends. Hi everyone, and welcome to Evangelical, a show exploring the world inside and outside the evangelical subculture. I'm your host, Blake Chastain. This week's guest is Jason Stellman, author of the new book Misfit Faith, Confessions of a Drunk Ex-Pastor, and also the co-host of the Drunk Ex-Pastors podcast. In this conversation, Jason and I talk about his transition from being a Presbyterian minister in the PCA denomination to converting to Catholicism. We also talk about his book, as well as his podcast, and how loving people is better than fighting over theological points, and also why Catholic, Episcopal, and Orthodox faith expressions are so appealing to ex-evangelicals. As always, you can follow the show on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Anchor at ex-evangelicalpod. You can follow me on Twitter at brchastain, and you can also support the show via Patreon at patreon.com/ex-evangelicalpod, or by leaving a review of the show in iTunes. All right, let's get into it. Hey everybody, welcome back to Evangelical. I have with me Jason Stellman. He is one half of the show Drunk Ex-Pastors, as well as the author of the new book Misfit Faith, Confessions of a Drunk Ex-Pastor. Welcome to the show, Jason.
Thanks, Blake. Thanks for having me.
I'm glad we could talk. Let's just. The show is usually just is really about sort of faith transitions, so it fits really well with your book and what it's about. Again, it's called Misfit Faith, and it's about your sort of journey from being a Presbyterian pastor to leaving that ministry and moving into Catholicism. So that's it dovetails really nicely.
Yeah.
But let's just sort of start at the beginning. In your book, you mentioned you grew up in Southern California. So what was your sort of environment there like?
Yeah. I grew up in Orange County, and my house wasn't really very religious. You know, we went to church a couple times a year, but that was it. It wasn't anything that really was a powerful motivating factor for my family at all. My mom sent my brother and me to Awana. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Awana. It's kind of like Boy Scouts, kind of Christian Boy Scouts with like less camping and more Bible, I guess. And that's when I first made a profession of faith, because I was basically told I was going to miss the rapture and go through the Great Tribulation alone.
Oh, God.
So I prayed a prayer, and I talk about this in the intro of the book, I think. Prayed a prayer, but it didn't really take. I didn't really take my faith seriously till high school, when I started attending a high school that was run by a big church called Calvary Chapel in Costa Mesa, California. And that's when I got pretty hardcore for Jesus, and
Yeah.
eventually went on the mission field with Calvary to Africa and then to Europe, and moved back to the U.S. In 2000 from the mission field, and started attending Westminster Seminary because I'd become a Calvinist a few years prior to that, which in my former church was kind of like the worst thing you could ever be. Except maybe Catholic, but then I became that too. So I went to seminary for a few years and graduated in 2004, and that's when I moved up to the Seattle area to plant Exile Presbyterian Church. And it was I pastored Exile from 2006 to 2012.
Okay.
But it was really the last 4 years of my ministry at Exile, from 2008 to 2012. That's when I was wrestling with Catholic stuff. I'd come across an article about sola scriptura, the idea that the Bible alone is our authority from God for special revelation. And I was written by a Catholic guy, this article was, who had used to be a Protestant like me. And it really kind of it was like this little pebble that began an avalanche of literally every waking hour wrestling with, the Pope and justification and Mary and saints and all this stuff. And I just wrestled and thought and prayed and studied. And eventually, after 4 years of this, not getting anywhere, I realized, I think I've lost this struggle, and I need to step down from my ministry. So that's what I did in 2012, and then later that year is when I was received into the Catholic Church.
So I'd love to unpack that a little bit. Because
Yeah, man.
yeah. So I'd love to just kind of dive into that because I really want to give a lot of time to your journey into Catholicism and everything. But a lot of your book is also, one of the things I picked up on is that you actually convinced your parents to get you to let you go to a Christian school, to this Calvary school, which to me,
Yeah.
it resonated with me because like I don't know, that phrase that's like some people are born to greatness, some have it thrust upon them. Some people are born into evangelicalism, and some people, and like that for me, that was I also like jumped in, so that sort of resonated with me that you had that impulse back and when you were in high school to sort of engage with spiritual things, and like the evangelical stuff was probably the loudest thing around you, right?
Yeah, it wasn't completely like holy motivations or anything like that. It was basically some friends I had, some really good friends. My freshman year of high school, I went to just a regular public school. Were really close, and they had grown up at this church, Calvary Chapel. And then I moved away with my family to about 25 miles south and started going to a different school sophomore year. And my friends from my freshman year had all started going to Calvary Chapel their sophomore year to the high school. And, I missed them, and I didn't really know anybody at my new school. And I just felt like this little fish in a huge pond. And, I wasn't much of a partier, and Dana Hills High School, where I was going my sophomore year, was like such a party school. And I just never really felt like I never clicked for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so then that's when I asked my parents, like, let me go to Calvary Chapel High School next year. I'll help pay for it, blah, blah, blah. So when I went, it was mostly to kind of reconnect with friends and be a
Gotcha.
part of but then, a couple months in, that's when it kind of took, it was like, I used to just make fun of the whole thing. Like, we would all just kind of make fun of the kids who were on fire for the Lord and all this stuff. And
Yeah.
they talk about getting in the Word and all these like weird Christian phrases that we just thought were hilarious. But then, through osmosis or the Holy Spirit or some combination of the two, after a couple months at Calvary, I became one of those kids who was like super, super on fire. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of how I got there. It wasn't the most holy of motivations, but it did have an effect on me for sure.
Sure, yeah. I got pulled into like a youth group because, I moved at the end of a freshman year, moved states, and like the kids I knew ended up being the kids that I knew at a youth group, and then, like things just sort of, it's a snowball. I think it's bigger, for sure. So that definitely makes sense that was the initial pull. But then you just, you're in it all of a sudden.
Yeah.
So from there, the Calvary Chapel, I'm just sort of curious about that as an organization. There's one in Illinois, but I don't know whether they're all related or not. Do they have a larger organization, or is it just an individual?
Yeah, they do. They do. I mean, they call themselves non-denominational, but they function very much like a denomination. Mm-hmm. There are certain distinctives, doctrinal distinctives, they call them, that you sort of have to hold in order to be a Calvary Chapel. Mostly focused on things like the pre-tribulational rapture, dispensational eschatology. They're charismatic, but very conservatively charismatic, okay. And so they're not. They would look at like the Vineyard, for example, which grew out of Calvary Chapel in the 80s. They would look at the Vineyard as like kind of going too far with the gifts of the Spirit. But something like being a Calvinist is pretty much a theological expletive. Sure. And so is denying the pre-trib rapture, and so when I accepted Calvin into my heart and then became amillennial.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Skype is being Skype. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So you said that you accepted John Calvin into your heart, and became amillennial, and that was heresy in that group. So
Yeah,
yeah,
that's basically the worst thing you could do, and I did it. So
yeah,
that's what happened.
yeah. And what was your mission experience like?
Yeah, well, I went. It was right after graduating high school. I went with two of my friends, the very two guys who got me to go to Calvary in the first place. The three of us went to Uganda and worked with an organization over there for about 8 months. And I mean, that was just a mind-blowing experience to be an 18-year-old kid,
I'm
kind of
sure.
living with your two friends in this little village outside of this African city. No, this is back in the day too. So this is before there even was internet. But I mean, we didn't even have a working phone. The power would go out. It was just, it was a total culture shock, but so formative. And then even more formative was, in a few years after that is when I moved to Budapest, Hungary, to help out with a new Calvary Chapel that we were planting in Budapest. And I lived there for 6 years, and that was, just again, a massive culture shock. Not as massive as being in Africa, but it was more formative even because I was kind of figuring out who I was. And, this is when I even first started thinking about Catholicism. I share about this in the intro of the book. Just being in a country with just cathedrals and these beautiful churches and gargoyles and, wrought iron everywhere. And it's all just so, it's just all so medieval and so Catholic and so beautiful. So my very first flirtations with Catholic ideas came from reading guys like Peter Kraft and even C.S. Lewis, living in Europe as a young, early 20s guy, figuring stuff out. It was really powerful to recognize that, Christianity is bigger than Southern California megachurch evangelicalism.
Yeah.
And it's so unfortunate that so many people I know from my Calvary days still haven't figured that out.
Right.
And, my advice to them is like, hop on a plane and go somewhere, because you'll realize pretty quick that, the world that you inhabit is just a little tiny bubble, and there's so much more out there to learn and experience.
Yeah. That's actually, you mentioned that passage, and it was actually one that I jotted down before our conversation because I really liked it. About it. You say to Catholics or people with a Catholic influence, God is very real. He has more than a formula or a systematic theology. He has reality, substance, and texture. And I really love that thought because that definitely sort of rings true. I became an Anglophobe in college, and so I took it. I took a short trip over to England with like a couple weeks with a history class. And the same sort of thing about just the age of things definitely stood out when you go somewhere in Europe because it's, the oldest thing around here is like 300 years old. And not much else. But there it stretches back a millennium.
Yeah. And then especially Southern California, because that place is newer than, you don't have on the East Coast, you've got some history in the U.S., but in Southern California, it's like, no, the oldest thing we have is that Bed Bath and Beyond. It's been there since like 2003, and it's like, that's it. So yeah, that passage you quoted, that was from my journal. I wrote that like in, I don't know, 1995 or something. And as I was writing the book, I was dusting off my old journals from Hungary and found that passage about, really feeling this ancient connection with things by being exposed to just old stuff, and old traditions and old beliefs. I love that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
Give me that old-time religion. Give me that old-time religion. Give me that old-time religion, Lord. It's good enough for me. It was good for Paul and Silas. It was good for Paul and Silas. It was good for Paul and Silas. Lord, it's good Give me that old time religion. Give me that old time religion. Give me that old time religion, Lord. It's good enough for me.
So just sort of like walking through your story a little bit more too. Does college fit in there somewhere too, where you're, and is it a Christian college or anything like that?
Yeah, so I immediately upon graduating high school, I went to Africa. At the time, it was like, the rapture is going to happen in probably New Year's Eve 1992 into 1993 is when the rapture is going to happen. So why would I waste time learning a bunch of things? I didn't. And in Calvary, it was sort of, for someone like me, college was sort of dissuaded because people knew I was called to ministry, and it's a big waste of time to go learn a bunch of earthly, worldly, secular stuff. It wasn't until I moved back from the mission field in 2000 and wanted to go to seminary that I needed to get some undergrad credits under my belt, which I did in the easiest way possible, because the seminary I went to, Westminster, the state allows them to accept students without a BA if they've got a significant amount of ministry experience, and there's like a formula for this many years of ministry experience means you just need this many credits. So I took a year or two of undergrad only before I went to seminary.
Gotcha. And then from there you went into Presbyterian. And was it PCUSA or was it a different, that's the only one I can identify and rattle off in my head is PCUSA. So
yeah, it was PCA, which is Presbyterian Church in America. They broke off from the mainline church in the 70s and wanted to be a more conservative expression of Presbyterian theology. So it's among the conservative Presbyterians out there, the PCA is by far the biggest.
Okay.
But it's still smaller than the mainline.
Okay. And then you then was your first ministry moving and starting this church once you?
Yeah, as a Presbyterian, yeah. So
okay.
I graduated seminary in 2004 and then moved up to the Pacific Northwest to plant Exile Presbyterian Church. And that was, I had planned to just do that for my whole life. I did not have any misgivings, any hesitation. It was like, no, this is what I want to do. I'm just going to eventually be this 85-year-old dude pastoring this church, trying to be faithful. Because I didn't have anything. There was nothing about it that made me discontent or restless. It was just that I couldn't shake these Catholic questions, and that's the only reason I stepped down. And it was very reluctant. It was very much a hard-fought battle that I lost. But I'm the kind of person who just can't do something for a paycheck or say things that I don't think are true just because I don't want to have to face the unknown. So that's why I stepped down. But yeah, Exile Presbyterian was all I really wanted to do for the rest of my life. It just didn't work out that way.
Yeah. So what was it? I mean, what was it like being? I mean, you're a pastor, so you are essentially a professional representation of something that most people consider personal. It's their faith. It's. I mean, they may want to share it a lot, especially in evangelicalism. It's something you're supposed to share, but being a pastor and going through this intense faith shift and having to be public about it, what was that like? I mean, that's just such an open question, but I'm just really curious as to, because a lot of people that I talk to aren't. I mean, I've talked to a few pastors as part of the show, but a lot of them are the people that are in the pews. So what was that like going through such a monumental and significant shift in public and in a position of leadership?
Well, I mean, it's really isolating. I think it's probably isolating as a pastor anyway, just because if you're having significant questions about the beliefs you're supposed to hold, it's not easy to voice them, because you're supposed to be the strong one for your congregation. And even when it comes to your fellow ministers, It's, I was kind of known for being the hardcore, old school Presbyterian guy, and so when I started having these doubts, and the doubts I was having were about the very fundamental tenets of the Reformation, Scripture alone and grace alone. Those are the two formulas that really set us apart from the Catholics and justify our whole reason for having a Reformation and existing in the first place. And so to be questioning those things isn't exactly the kind of thing you could admit to. Mm-hmm. So I would do everything from I created a fake blog or a fake blog account so I could try to dialogue with people I knew, but as someone else, Mm-hmm. And I read a lot, but I had very few people that I could really bounce these things off of. What I eventually did was when I finally told my elders that I was struggling with these things, they let me take a 3-month sabbatical to sort of travel and seek out other Presbyterian and Reformed theologians that I could really sit down with and who could talk me off the ledge, But yeah, it's hard as a pastor because if you're questioning things, you don't really have a safe place or context in which to wrestle, mm-hmm. because you've got this image and this aura that you're supposed to maintain, and if our pastor is doubting this stuff, then what do we do with that? And so it was really hard. It was really, really hard.
I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you mentioned as far as the things that are at the heart of the Reformation and the things that you felt you could reconcile yourself to Catholicism, because I think that's that's central to your story. And so if you could tease that out a little bit, like what you mentioned some of the authors and things you were reading, but were there other aspects of Catholicism that began to draw you towards the Catholic Church?
Yeah, it started. It started pretty typically, pretty academically. Mm-hmm. Sola Scriptura. What's the relationship between the Bible and the Church and authority, and wrestling through those issues. And then that led to the heart of the matter, which for me, as a good Presbyterian, is the gospel. The whole thing is the gospel. So even when I became convinced that apostolic succession, for example, is true, this idea that the bishops today are the successors of the apostles by means of the laying on of hands, and the Bishop of Rome, Pope Francis, or at the time Benedict, is the successor of St. Peter, and all this. Even when I became convinced of that stuff academically, it's a historical fact that this is true, it didn't carry that much weight because, well, you guys don't know the gospel. Catholic people, the Catholic Church is wrong about the basic question of what must I do to be saved. But since I've been, kind of thrown off balance by the Catholic view of, Scripture and stuff, maybe I should give them a chance to tell me what they say about the gospel. Because up until that point, largely you learn about your enemies by your friends telling you what your enemies say. So you read a bunch of Presbyterians telling you what the Catholic Church says about this or that, mm-hmm. or the other thing. And it's not really charitable because you're not letting them tell you. You're basically listening to someone who hates what they say tell you what they say rather than letting them tell you. So I started to, read about grace and justification and imputation and all these concepts that surround how we become saved, and that really had a profound effect because it occurred to me that the basic Catholic understanding of the gospel was much more consistent with what I would find in the New Testament. In fact, it got to the point where I started to think, geez, if the guys who wrote the New Testament were operating with a kind of Protestant set of assumptions, they wouldn't have written the things they wrote. But if they were operating from a basic set of Catholic presuppositions, then this is exactly the kind of thing you'd expect them to say. But then there were other things too. You know, I've always been very much a proponent of the goodness of creation, the goodness of earth, the goodness of the world. And I've always really, even as an evangelical, fought against this idea that we're supposed to be, you know, threatened by the world or threatened by secular music or movies, and that we need to have Christian versions of every secular thing so that we can protect ourselves from, you know, being lied to and being tempted and all this. I've always, you know, had a hard time with that stuff. Mm-hmm. But then, you know, really understanding the Catholic emphasis on both the Trinity, but even more on the incarnation of the Son and what that means for humanity, that Christ, according to the Orthodox way of looking at things, that the Son assumed a human nature, right, and took on humanity and lived in it, died in it, rose in it, ascended with it into heaven, and has now glorified humanity as the God-man to this very day and forever. You know, that all has massive implications for how we look at the world and how we understand our place in the world. And I tease this out pretty significantly in the book. Mm-hmm. But that was a big draw too, because it was as though these Catholic emphases were justifying knee-jerk positions that I already held but didn't really know why. And so it made me understand, like, oh, of course, it's because of Jesus. That's why I'm not supposed to be ashamed of my own weakness and ashamed of my own flesh and ashamed of my own humanity. It's because of what Jesus did. And I knew this all as a Presbyterian, like academically, but it didn't function for me in a powerful way. You know, a lot of these Trinity and deity of Christ and all this stuff, a lot of that was just stuff I would use as ammunition against Mormons if they knocked on my door.
Yeah.
You know, but it didn't function for me on a practical level at all until I started really, you know, reading enough Catholics to understand that, you know, especially G.K. Chesterton, that, wow, like this incarnation stuff is like the air you breathe. Like this is in the water supply, and it is operative behind everything else. Once I started to really get that, it really resonated with me on a personal level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that aspect of your book is and it's something that's a through line as far as the incarnation. And you have one chapter that talks about how grace perfects nature. I believe it's the chapter Matter Matters, and mm-hmm. Then that carries all the way throughout. And that was something that I really liked about your book, is that you really sort of tear down that false dichotomy between the flesh and the spirit, because as you say in the book, you talk about how, and just as you said now, how God became man and he lived a human life and all of that, and that has huge implications. But that is something that somehow gets lost in evangelicalism, in a really weird sort of way.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in evangelicalism, largely, at least my experience of it, I can speak to that. You know, you are supposed to be suspicious of anything secular, because they're operating from this place of antithesis. You know, this place of heaven versus earth. You know, faith versus reason, or you know, the secular versus the sacred, and all these kinds of ideas. And so that's why you have contemporary Christian music. That's why you have Christian radio stations and Christian bookstores, because we need to offer people a baptized version of every worldly thing they want in order to protect them from what will happen if they just listen to the radio. And like every error, it's a Christological error. You know, it is a mistake about the way heaven and earth intersect. It's a mistake about the relationship of divinity to humanity. And where do you go in order to correct a mistaken way of thinking about the intersection of heaven and earth? You go to Jesus. You go to the place where literally, ontologically, in one person, humanity and divinity are together in this union, in this hypostatic union of the two natures in the one person of Christ. So for me, it became very, it ceased to be academic and it became incredibly practical. But yeah, you're right. In my evangelical, experience, you just can't trust the flesh. You just can't trust the world. You can't trust earth. You can't trust the material things. And it's almost as though Jesus didn't rise in the body. It's almost as though Jesus rose as a phantom, and the age to come is going to be this disembodied, ethereal state where we float around, all of which is very Gnostic. Mm-hmm. And, there's no better cure for Gnosticism than the Catholic Church and the emphasis on the coming in the flesh of the Son.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I've started attending Episcopal churches, which has a lot of similarities to Catholicism, and that's very new. But that is a huge emphasis. And,
right.
It's hard to miss when it's there every single service.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Me love everybody, makes me love everybody, and it's good enough for me. Give me that old time religion. Give me that old time religion. Give me that old time religion, Lord, it's good enough for me.
So I do want to turn a little bit more specifically to the book. One thing that screamed out at me is that at one point it seemed that this book contract came in the middle of your sort of this major shift, and that you didn't even really want to go through with it because of that. And then you sort of turned the book into a project of exploring your own misfit faith, which I thought was very honest and very open for an author to say.
Yeah, because it's funny. I experienced this doctrinal, theological shift, right? And it was as a pastor. So it all, and a pastor who had, I'd already published before, and I had a popular blog, and so this shift I had, from Protestantism into the Catholic Church was very public. And I guess I just assumed that I would be a Catholic version of my old Protestant self. I just assumed that, well, I'm not going to be a priest, but I'll be a Catholic apologist guy and run around and try to convince everybody that Catholicism is true and defend what I did and all this. And I just, I just assumed this. And I remember I went out to Steubenville, Ohio, to speak at Franciscan University's big conference they have with Scott Hahn. And I spoke, and there, a couple thousand people there, and it went really great. And I was telling my priest about it when I got back, because he was kind of my spiritual advisor. We'd meet every week. And he asked me, do you want to be this guy? Like, is this what you want? And I was like, well, yeah, I guess, and I'm hemming and hawing. And he just said, I just want to know if this is what you want. And it occurred to me that I hadn't really asked myself that question. Do I want to go straight back into some form of spokesmanship for a new team? And it occurred to me that no, I don't want to. Actually, this, it's really, there's a lot of pressure, and it's really, there's a lot of drawbacks to that, and I never even thought about it. But, I kind of took myself out of that world and withdrew from that world, and I shut down my old blog and stopped speaking. And but I was in the middle of writing this book, right? And this book was initially this big defense of what I did. It was a big, apologetic for being Catholic. And when I finished it, I hated it because it was so, polemical and argumentative, and I just had ceased to be that person, because I found that once I stepped away from official ministry, all of my desire for debate and my bloodlust for argumentation and arguing from the Bible about this or that thing, all of that just kind of disappeared. It just left. And I didn't care anymore if people believed me or agreed with me or liked what I was saying. It was just the weirdest thing. So this doctrinal theological shift gave way to this massive existential shift, which was even bigger, at least on the inside. And, from my perspective, it was even bigger.
Yeah.
This desire to just love my neighbor and find the good in what my opponent is saying and find common ground rather than trying to build a wall. I want to try to build a bridge. And all of this, of course, is stemming from the incarnation of Christ, because, what more could God have done to find common ground with humanity than assume human nature himself, right? And so after writing this book and hating it, I asked my publisher, I said, I don't like it. It does not reflect who I am. And is there any way I could just start over? And, thankfully they were very elastic and said yes.
That's good.
So they said, yeah, you know what, if you don't like it, then start over. And so I did. And that's what Misfit Faith was the result of, was that kind of writing one thing, realizing, this doesn't smack of humility. This doesn't smack of, Christ at all. And them letting me kind of back out and start from scratch. And, that's where Misfit Faith came from.
Yeah. And I think that honesty and that vulnerability does come out in the book very clearly, that this was something that you went through a lot to get to this point. And you thought through a number of things. And so that is very reflective in the book. One of the lines that stuck out to me was in a chapter where you are really talking about finding common ground instead of fighting. And you actually wrote, "I no longer feel the need to fight," and that is, it's such an interesting thing if you've gone through it yourself or gone through something similar where you just begin to let your guard down. And that it actually is the thing that allows you to, like you said, love your neighbor in a more meaningful way when you're not trying to evangelize all the frickin' time.
Well, yeah, and there's a section in there somewhere where it's called ironic humility. And it stems from this audacious stance that the church takes, If you talk to a Methodist, the Methodist will say, "Well, we're our denomination is called the United Methodists, and we're different from the Presbyterians and the Baptists because of this, and this." The Catholic Church doesn't see itself as another denomination, to choose from. It sees itself as just the church that's always been here, right? And that kind of audacious position actually ironically produces or can produce a humility on the part of the person who is a part of that church, because it's a weird thing to realize that if all of the other denominations disappeared, it wouldn't affect the Catholic Church in any way. Because when I was a Presbyterian, the position was always like, well, if the Catholic Church would repent over the Council of Trent and repent over papal infallibility and all the stuff about Mary, and if they would then we would stop our fight and we would join them. But we have no choice but to draw this line in the sand and be separate and protest because we're Protestant. So they sort of need a foil to justify their own ongoing existence. We exist because the church got it wrong here, there, and the other place. And so our job is to stand in marked protest until they get it right. Well, when I became a Catholic, all of a sudden it was like, oh, well, this is just what we do and who we are, and we've always been around, we'll always be here. And we're not sort of taking our cues from our opponents. In fact, our opponents are rival siblings and we're their mother. And, when the church you're in has that view of itself, which on the one hand can sound incredibly audacious and ridiculous, but if that is their position, it does affect the way you feel when you look around. If the Catholic Church is their mother, mothers don't engage in sibling rivalries. Mothers just make sure the light's always on so their kids can come home if they want to. In other words, mothers are going to try to referee and bring peace if the children are fighting. They're not supposed to engage in that fight. They're supposed to seek to be a place of peace and safety, right? So for me, it was like, yeah, geez, being a part of something like this sort of blunts the sharpness of my teeth. When all I used to want to do is just devour people with how awesome my theology was. And it's like all of a sudden it was like, no, I'd rather just try to love people. And if they want to agree with me, they can. But if they don't, it's not going to affect the way I feel about them in the least bit.
And so how does that that sort of more relaxed that eventually over a period of time must have led to you doing your show with your friend Christian, which is Drunk Ex-Pastors, and that relaxed sort of. I mean, listening to your show, you are very relaxed.
Yeah.
You're just very. The two of you have known each other for decades, and that's evident in your rapport. And then I've listened to an episode where you had a guest on. I think it was someone that had been in your church as a youth. And I remember the line that comes to mind is, I think you say when you decided to be lesbian, or when you decided to be gay.
Yeah.
And it was just, I mean, you're poking fun at your old self, kind of, and all that sort of stuff. But it was sort of evidenced in the way you just made a joke about it.
When we started Drunk Ex-Pastors, I mean, it was this thing we did, like, hey, we hang out every week, and we've known each other for 25 years. We hang out every week. We have a few drinks, have a few laughs, solve the world's problems, talk about whatever. What if we record it and put it out there? And so one day I just showed up with a little lapel mic and a tiny MP3 recorder, and that was, episode 1 of Drunk Ex-Pastors. It wasn't even called Drunk Ex-Pastors yet. A couple episodes in, Christian, my co-host, said, dude, we should call it Drunk Ex-Pastors. And I'm like, I don't know, man. I don't know if I could, I already have enough people pissed off at me out there. This is just going to make it worse. But we decided, let's just do it, and it's been very therapeutic for me, just because it is two guys who've known each other for a long time, who talk and have a couple drinks, and it's completely real, it's completely authentic, it's completely genuine. And for me, especially more than him, he's an ex-pastor also, but he stopped it long before I did. So for me, it was like, geez, it's been so long since I felt like I can just be me, and just say what I think and not have to constantly look over my shoulder or censor myself or whatever else. So doing that podcast and then writing this book, which is also completely real, were both very liberating, because I feel like I spent a lot of time trying to hide my doubts or whatever else, instead of just embracing the doubt, the unknowing, the ambiguity, all of that. There's something very freeing about finally putting yourself in a position where you can just be yourself, just be you, just do you, say what you think. And, strangely enough, this big old community of people has gathered around this show. And, we got like 60,000 people listening to us every month. And people, like, it really means something to them, and they can't wait till every Sunday night when the new episode drops, and they listen to it immediately and talk about it throughout the week. And all these people have gotten to know each other through this. It's got this web of, like, connection that's so beautiful. So yeah, I mean, that and Misfit Faith are two of my favorite things I've been able to do since leaving the ministry.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and I mean, I've really enjoyed the shows I've listened to, and I think overall, just the sort of the way in which podcasts have begun to fill a void that people kind of feel. I don't know whether it's like like the way I describe this show is it's for people that are religiously disaffected.
Yeah.
It's people that and a lot of the show is, I mean, it's geared towards the commonalities we all have about our hangups with evangelicalism, etc. But I mean, shows like yours and others out there are. I think what you said about it being real is like it's really a sort of a judgment on church culture in general, because people don't feel like they can be, even pastors, maybe even especially pastors. Like,
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's especially pastors, but you're right. NPR just did a piece on podcasting, and they talked about us, and they talked about a few of the other podcasts out there. And just like what you just said, Blake, about how, even a radio show is like, 4 9-minute segments or whatever. You're live on the air. You gotta wrap it up. You gotta keep to the timetable. Whereas a podcast, you just hit record and hit stop when you're done. And our show might be 90 minutes long. It might be 2 hours long. It's just whenever we're done, we're not beholden to a denominational oversight board or corporate sponsorship or anything else that sort of limits what we can say. And I think that's what makes it authentic, because you can and also having a couple drinks and doing a shot at the beginning helps. Because now it's like, even if I wanted to try to make myself look good, I can't, so it's like, yep, this is how we sound. This is what we think,
Sure.
Take it or leave it,
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that is, to me, and my thing, that my positive affirmation sort of thing is I think everyone always benefits from being honest, and with themselves, I think especially, but then also with the way that they feel comfortable representing themselves. And there is something that tells people to not be who they are, and that's the most upsetting. That's the most upsetting thing about evangelicalism, and is one of the major critiques of that I kind of lobby throughout the show, is you don't let people be their selves. I'm not swearing because my daughter's awake.
Yeah.
And she might be able to hear me. but anyways, but drunk ex-pastors, you don't have that. And it's also great that you, from the other side, from the sort of like, you feel spiritual, or some people might be spiritual but don't always talk about it. You guys just talk about whatever, but then it's not off the table to talk about something that may have some sort of philosophical ramifications. And it's great to have a dueling opinion. You have your history, Christian has his, and you bring that all to bear, which it makes for a really great show.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that's what we hear a lot, is that people will say, I'm post-evangelical. I one time identified that way, but not anymore. But I don't like hate God or anything, and I kind of wish I still had somewhere to go, or some group to gather with, or whatever. And people have found drunk ex-pastors to be that kind of way of kind of nurturing that and nursing that desire, as well as Misfit Faith, the book. People have said, some of the Amazon reviews are mind-blowing. They'll say things like, I'm an atheist, but I read this book in one sitting and I couldn't stop thinking about it all day. I think that if there's anything to take away from all this, it's that there's more than just one way. Just like going back to what we were talking about earlier about, the church is bigger than Southern California megachurch evangelicalism. Likewise, there's more than just one way to do this. Evangelicalism is one way that people identify with and appreciate for a time at least. But there are other ways. There are ancient ways like, the Church of England or the Church of Rome or Orthodoxy. There are also alternative ways, to do things that may not look the same or smell the same or sound the same as evangelicalism, but they're no less powerful. In many ways, they're more powerful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that need for some of the things in your book really You talk in your book about the need for ritual, and that is present in a lot of other places outside of evangelicalism. Evangelicalism is new. There just aren't that many rituals, and nobody can frickin' agree about what they're supposed to be anyways.
Yeah. And I think that you can see even in movements like the emergent church movement, and all that kind of thing, you sort of see in that a desire, sometimes I think misguided, but still a desire to tap into something older than Beatlemania. Because I mean, my church, Calvary Chapel, started during the Jesus movement of the mid 1960s, and you get to a point where, geez, I kind of like candles, and I kind of like incense, and I kind of like stained glass and icons, and all these sort of. I think these things touch upon a sacramental instinct that we have. I think man, no matter whether he's beating a drum in the darkest jungles of South America or he's a wealthy New England Episcopalian, man has a desire to connect with supernatural things, but by means of natural things, right?
Yeah.
So water, wine, books, smells, bells, these kinds of things, I think they sort of tap into an instinct that we have because we're human, because we're embedded, enfleshed, that we have no other choice but to connect with the non-physical world by means of physical things. And that's why I think so many people, disaffected evangelicals, are turning toward Canterbury or Rome or Constantinople. Right? Because they want something that has some texture that they can hold. I mean, even in 1 John, the beginning of 1 John, that which we have seen, that's which we have touched, with our eyes have seen, what our hands have handled. These are the things that we proclaim to you, right? It's not just theology lectures. I think people desire something they can hold on to. And I think much of kind of baby boomer evangelicalism, at least, has been so afraid of the physical world that they've swung the pendulum so far away from physical things. And I think Gen Xers and millennials are kind of going, nope, time to swing that pendulum back a bit toward the middle.
Yeah. And you mentioned 1 John, and it was really just, I don't know, serendipitous that some of the major passages that you highlighted in Philippians, the Philippian hymn from Philippians 2, and then also 1 John in a few places. That just actually, those two sections were the two things I actually learned how to read in Greek in college. So so like one semester was first I was like a biblit minor, so I took 2 years of Greek. So the Philippian hymn and what you talk about in kenosis and God emptying himself and what that means, and for our understanding of him and of the incarnation and that God is love, and in 1 John, and that's the only place that God has given like a clear definition of what he is that God is love. In addition to all the things we were just talking about the need for physicality, and the need for ritual, it's just this happy coincidence for me reading your book that those were the resonant passages for you too, because it was those things, those passages that really made Scripture and even God in general, God and Christianity in general, the thing remain relevant to me. And I thought it was really fascinating that those were the things that you shared in your book too.
Yeah, that's a trip, huh?
Yeah, totally crazy. But I'm really happy that those were and again, just for my own personal reasons, that those were the things that resonated with you.
Give me that old-time religion. Give me that old-time religion. Give me that old-time religion, Lord, it's good enough for me. Give me that old-time religion. Give me that old-time religion. Give me that old-time religion, Lord, it's good enough for me.
I would love to point people towards where they can find your book, and if you could plug that as well as your podcast.
Yeah. So drunkexpastors.com is the podcast. We're also on Facebook. If you go to drunkexpastors.com/book, or jasonstellman.com/misfitfaith, you can find links to order the book anywhere fine books are sold. Most people buy them off Amazon, so you can just do a search for the book on Amazon too. And then also I just point out, on my website, jasonstellman.com, there's a tab for mentoring, because I do just kind of seeing the responses I've gotten from people about the book has made me realize that, maybe I ought to do like a 6-week mentoring class that's kind of loosely based on the book. That's a personal one-on-one thing with I'm taking 10 clients only. Cool. And so, yeah, so you can find stuff about that on jasonstellman.com, as well as booking me to speak. If you want me to speak, if you got a group, I'm going to head out to Indiana to speak to a group of 50 or so Catholic businessmen and their significant others next week. If you've got a group like that and you want to have me come speak, then you can find information about that too on my website.
Cool. And you guys have a Patreon too for your podcast, is that right?
Yeah, I didn't think it was, good to ask for money on your show, but
no, it's okay.
Yeah, you can support us on Patreon. I think it's patreon.com/drunkexpastors. A lot of people just kind of support us like $1 per episode or something, and it's like, yeah, that's really cool. I mean, that really helps because we don't make any real money doing this, but we can cover expenses and pay our, keep the lights on and all that. So that's a really cool way to support us as well.
Cool. Great. Well, Jason, thank you very much for talking with me today. I really, really appreciate it.
Hey, it was my pleasure, Blake. Yeah.